We should have at least one computer up here in case there are.
That's a good idea.
Um,
They didn't actually bring my notes, but it would probably be.
I'll probably need to plug into one of these outfits.
Maybe
Maybe just
on the.
go on this end.
Here. You could scoot the table up too if you want. That would make it easier.
Yeah, maybe. Well,
Are you happy to use yours or should I bring mine?
either way.
I can make, you can, I'm supposed to have two, I guess. I'll just bring it anyways.
Well, if
I'm
yours is a little small.
Yeah, okay. I'm just looking up for the height of the camera.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're. No.
Thank you.
So I graduated in 20, I was there for a long time, but I graduated in 2013. I mean, I started in 2002, so I was there for hours.
Oh, yeah.
We were in touch because I was so we were I never knew him.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Is this me?
Yeah, you're holding it, so.
I grabbed his microphone, so I have to speak first. I just want to say, first of all, what a wonderfully rich set of papers this was. This has been exactly, I think, what we hoped for when we organized the conference, and the papers responded in just as diverse set of ways as we had, beyond what we had imagined, even. With some of the questions, all of the questions, in fact, in the call for papers. What does it mean to be a theorist? What kinds of identities does research in music theory address? How does identity shape theory? All of these questions, I think, have come into play in fascinating ways. And we decided early on in the process of planning the conference to have, to end it with a roundtable rather than, say, a keynote address, precisely because, well, a number of reasons. The decentering move that thinking about identity compels, and to not have a kind of authoritative position. And I think what we're hoping for is a discussion that involves all of you. This will not be the five of us holding forth or even offer formal responses to some of these questions. So to get things started, I want to just share one thought I had that may draw in a few of the papers, but really was prompted by Andrew Chung's paper yesterday. And that is the thought that one of the things that music theorists do, if we take as ecumenical a view of theory as possible, is to connect music, musical experiences of all sorts with language, with symbolic systems. And that, as soon as that is done in any way, there are ramifications, right? And we saw this in Julia's paper, for example, thinking about pulse. You start thinking about the term pulse, you look at the sources, it ramifies outward in unpredictable ways. And I think Andrew's paper really brought this to the fore with the wolf tone and the beautiful way that he took that discourse as an expression of colonialism writ large. But within these ramified systems of language, these networks of language, they are also the systems in which we or individuals are interpolated, in which they form their identities. And so, again, thinking across the papers, so much stems from the choice of what a theory is going to focus on what the word will be brought to bear. Polyphony in the case of Brian Fraley's paper in Georgia. And I think, I'm not going to try to go through every one of them, but I think there is probably a point or a word or a set of words that become these points of ramification within which identities form, take on meaning, and they're not necessarily compatible with one another, right? There's not an overarching rationality that ties this all together. Ashanta's paper, right, about the way that on the one hand, Sri Lankan theory responds to the imperatives of colonialism, but on the other hand is responding to Hindustani music and defining itself against that. So the competing logics within it. And I think I'll stop there. I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but as a point of departure, if anyone has any thoughts from that, that'd be great. I'll pass it along to the mic along to whoever else would like to add more to the mix.
This is on, I think. Hello, yes. Thank you, August, for those remarks. I guess to piggyback on those comments, music theory is a form of knowledge, it's a form of knowing the world out there, and knowledge is power, is culture. Culture is related to agriculture, is related to cultivating the land, which is in some ways turning wilderness into ordered structure, a productive structure for those who, it's the act of extracting value from the land. In a sense, everything is an act of colonization. I was fascinated by Andrew's paper as well, but I guess my caveat though there is, if we come to a point where everything is an act of colonization, perhaps the metaphor becomes meaningless at some point because it doesn't allow you to make distinctions. Which I think there are distinctions that should be made between the real wolf and the metaphoric or the metonymic wolf. Or at least it may be important to distinguish, to realize when real violence is being perpetrated on human beings and the earth versus developing new forms of cultural activities, which may be moving on to equal temperament as opposed to mean tone. So that was one comment I had that one reason why I found again Answer's paper quite stimulating.
I think what I had in mind responds to that in some way, to the point of knowledge and power. And I think one of the red threads that occurred to me throughout this was thinking about the identity of what defines a music theorist. I guess we got all these inputs about personal background, the skills involved, and I think we can talk more about these aspects. And obviously also what is written, I guess that also was a big point in Peter's paper just now, both the personal and the what is written, but the other thread is then who it is written for, right? And I think this is something that first crossed my mind with Christian's paper yesterday, and this idea of a public music theory and musicology being somehow different from what we usually think of in music theory, and it seems very defining actually in thinking about the audience and how much agency they have in defining what theory is after all. And I guess it's an interesting double standing that we all have, because we might identify as music theorists, but we are at the same time the readers of music theory, and in that capacity define what ought to be in and out of the field. So I'm very much interested in maybe thinking that further also about how much agency we grant, or how much more we could include the audience in that. And I think this interesting slippage occurred to me in some of the wording Christine referred to in the invisible or annotator, and this annotator metaphor seemed to kind of do away with how much subjectivity is in this author function, and it seems to take, it seems to hide a bit all the subjectivity that goes into it, in the filtering, and has a lot of assumptions about what the audience wants as gossip or whatever. So I'm intrigued to think further about what that means in broader contexts of where we think what theory is and what it is not, and how to deal with these questions of identity.
Now I think it's on. Okay. Now I have to cough as soon as I turn the mic on. To sort of go along with what Steffi was saying, it's been interesting to overhear conversations or participate in conversations here, and hear people say, well, I'm not really a theorist, I'm more of a musicologist, but I'm a part of SMT, or I teach theory, but as a person who does history of theory, I'm kind of more a historian, or I feel like it's been interesting to hear those of us in this room try to reconcile those things in our own identities. And it has been something that I've thought about for a really long time. Like when I was thinking, okay, I want to do a history of theory topic for a dissertation, but how will that be received when I went to get a job? And I did actually have a deed at a job interview ask me point blank, like, are you a music theorist? And part of me wanted to say, what do you even think that means? And it's not where I currently work anyway, so I don't think that was the main issue. But it was a strange experience to be asked that, almost in a like being interrogated kind of a way. Oh yeah, there is a literal fingerprint in the front of her. Yeah. But I also really have taken away from all the papers that these issues of identity that are considered by some to be quite trendy, things having to do with gender identity and presentation, and race and class, sometimes are considered quite contemporary issues that have only just recently emerged. And I think one thing history of theory as a field can bring to the table that's really valuable is showing how those issues are actually quite old and have been dealt with in a lot of different ways for 1,000 years or more in some cases. So I find that really valuable to be able to point backward and say, you know, here's how other people have thought about those same issues. So I really enjoyed taking that from everybody's papers. And then selfishly, I also tend to look at these things in sort of a materialist point of view, because my own experience with history of theory right now is very tied to recreating experiments. And so I'm very interested in, I really want to know more about the hydraulic organ, and if I could buy one somewhere, or construct one or something. I'm really interested in these kind of older instruments and instrumentation that people would use to try to talk about sound. And again, selfishly, I will just plug that if you want to think more about those questions, tomorrow at 10:45, my co-author and I are presenting about the experiments in Rameau's Génération Harmonique, and we're going to invite the audience to participate in the one with the tweezers. So if you really, if you are feeling like you'd like to do something hands-on, that kind of thing has been really valuable for me, and so I'm excited to share that tomorrow. But I did notice how much instrumentation had to do with everybody's work here as well, and the keyboards and Andrew's paper and the organ specifically. I'm very intrigued by it. Thanks.
I suppose I should say some things. I guess questions of music theoretical historiographical identity emerge from me in relation to the generation of historians of theory that emerged on the scene in the 90s, the late 90s. Many, I studied with some of them. In their responses to the kind of new musicological assertions of identity that were then, in the late 80s and early 90s, very important. So I don't have any answers, but I have questions for all of you. Is like, what did that generation seem to historicize music theory as a response to Kerman, etc., in a way that dispersed identity through the texts and the discourses and the energies and things that were quote unquote surrounding, music theoretical objects. So I'm wondering today what our relationship with that generation of historians of theory is, because that's a question that animates me generally, both as a historian of theory and as a person with an identity, an identity or something.
Who else has thoughts to share? You can bring the mic around too if you want.
Yeah, we should.
So I think it does pick up.
Oh, it does pick up.
The room mic's full.
Oh,
okay.
The last two comments really resonated with me, partly because I got my doctorate basically in history of theory in '92, so I think when you're talking about that generation, me. And
Yes, I was aware.
and also the interrogation of "Are you a theorist?" It also happened to me, and like not to name anything, but there was one year when I had a submission up for the publication awards, and it was in history of theory, and they didn't give any award at all that year because they said there were no appropriate theoretical publications, and that really hurt. So talking about that generation, I've been saying to a lot of people, I'm so excited about the topic of this session, and it feels like, when I follow the posts from the Facebook page and everything, and I get my little emails that announce, the latest blog post. I'm interested in all of this stuff because I've been waiting for that to happen. And when I was doing history of theory, you were just translating. I mean, not just translating, of course, one never just translates, but we were just getting the things that we thought people needed to know about just out there. And I remember being so excited when Benito Rivera and other folks were just, thank goodness I don't have to read this in Latin. And, there's still some very important texts that still just need to be translated, but you run into so many issues, and I'm just so glad that the significance of what we do is being considered. When, you know, the plenary session a few years ago happened, I cried because I was like, I finally get to say what I didn't think I was allowed to say. And it relates very specifically to what we do and our identity. And, you know, I felt I had to be quiet about things I thought about figures in the field and historical figures, etc. And so I'm just, you have to start somewhere, I guess, for history of theory. So, you know, about that generation, I think we were doing the best we could. And there's always something you discover reading things from other cultures and other historical eras, because when I did my dissertation on Gottfried Weber, I discovered a whole world of cognitive science that I thought was implied in that work that I never would have known about. And so, anyway, I also don't want to talk too much, but I do feel like we were trying at that time in the 90s to do what we could, but it was, I felt like it was a middle stage of something that is now becoming something really exciting.
Frank, can I just say a quick word about Jana's comments? Thank you. Thank you for that. Your comment about translation, but not just translation. There's the literal act of translating Latin or German or any language into contemporary English. Yes, is a part of it, but to Scott's point too, it seems that one of the tasks of history of theory, as you said, was just to put stuff out there, make it available. But I'm fascinated by the fact that it's also translation in a more subtle sense, right? In the sense of explaining, well, here's the words that Rameau or whoever wrote, but now let's explain for our reader today what that means. And I think that move, right, it speaks to Abby's point. That's the move that allows one to say, oh, but I am a theorist, right? Because you're putting it into the terms of contemporary theory. And it also then makes it about the identity of the historian in a way, at least below the surface, maybe not explicitly. But thanks. Frank?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Scott's comment and Jana's thoughts about that topic. Very briefly, and I'm kind of providing or reminding all of you of the framework of that generation or that development of the field of history of music theory over the last 40 years. I think a major point that reflects exactly what you were saying and what you were applying to is Ian Bent's article, which was an SMT keynote on margin or center of history theory, which is, if we read that today, is first of all, it confirms that the burning importance back then was to provide sources. We need to find the texts and we need to provide text, so that source period. But more interestingly is, as he in a very nuanced and nice way describes that you were wrong on both sides. Either, as theorist, you were too much historian, as historian, you were too much theorist, which is of course not a problem of the margin history theory, but it was back then a problem of the disciplinary definition of both, musicology and theory, which tried in this 1980s discourse to find their independent ways. And it's great to see now a generation or two later, that this is not, that there's a complete different level of combination and collaboration. And the other point of framework is again a keynote SMT, Tom Christensen's text on the lives of music theorists, 2015-ish, something like that, which shifted the interest away, from the sources to that aspect of contextual biography, identity, actually. And I think and we're overcome that too, by going non-Western. He's I think the last of the generation who goes fully Western, And anyway, so these are kind of the two anchors, in between the discourse took place over the last two generations. And I think that what Jenna mentioned about her history in the field, confirms that pretty well.
It's funny, I have different anchors that are personal from the people.
Okay.
I mean, I've studied the Bean, but other people, but I think you're exactly, I think of the Cambridge History of Western Music Theory, which,
Of course.
as being, it also had a, Cambridge History of Western Music Theory also had the effect of like ending a phase, It opened a phase up, of course, but it also ended a phase insofar as it sought to be encyclopedic, of its time. But yeah, it's funny, I have, personal markers in the history of theory from the last 20 years or 25 years from the people I studied with that I value, but I wouldn't necessarily make claims that they, impacted the field like Ian's article or Cambridge History of Western Music Theory. So there's the identity of the field and the identity of our participation in the field, and then there's like the kind of like with Peter's talk, like the kind of father figure almost, with whom you study and how that influences you.
Thanks. I want to thank everyone for their papers as sort of, talking about center and periphery. I feel like I'm very peripheral to the kind of questions about identity as a music theorist. It's not something I've ever described myself as, but I did want to kind of, sort of narcissistically draw a connection between my paper and something in Julia's that I think kind of goes to some of these questions about identity a bit. One kind of funny thing is that we both included an image of the Musica Enchiriadis in our presentations. A sort of funny way that I think, I was interested in the way that people studying kind of Georgian music were looking backward to that as a kind of like, token or kind of a talisman of the origin of polyphony. And I think that she was looking at it in, I think, a fascinating way as kind of maybe more of an endpoint or a middle point in a kind of a larger process of the kind of connections across Islamic and European traditions. But what I was interested in is a move when we talk about identity to kind of try to look for one layer underneath, like that there's sort of, they describe themselves as X, but if you look into the larger context, really, it was sort of they were part of a larger sphere. There's kind of more context or something like that. So, for instance, her point that she's making about a more broader, generally Mediterranean understanding of music theory, of relationship of rhythm, and things like that. But I was thinking though, it's sort of that move of arguing for a more general kind of cultural base is extremely different, but reminiscent for me of the kind of nationalist Georgian move of saying, really, there's this substratum of European culture that goes even deeper than the sort of individual nations that we have. And then in some way you see how that moved toward a kind of a broadening out of the sort of substratum of identity can be used for nationalist ends as well as kind of anti-colonial ends. So I'm interested in these kind of moves that we make of scale when we're talking about different sort of identities in history.
I'm sorry, Brian, this isn't now a response to what you just said, which I'm still processing. But one of the things that that I loved in the two papers this morning that came out in Frank and Peters. And in the discussion before we broke for coffee about the question of what counts as theory and therefore who is a theorist. I was very struck by Fetise's comment that Frank quoted, right, that this is the least rational theory. And on the one hand, that points to rationality, systematicity, right, as one of the things that, if there are no absolute through lines as to what music theory is, that is one that's fairly consistent, right, that this is an organized way of thinking about music. And the idea, though, on the other hand, that rationality, it suggests that there may be a logic, that there may be an answer in some abstract way to the yes or no question, is this theory, even if it's only in a localized sense of, in this context, as with Bossius, for instance, right? I was fascinated by, well, in one context, no. In another context, sure. But that there might be something like a sliding scale or a spectrum or a range of possibilities, and that there are thresholds even to rationality, right? That would, within a theory, that would then lead to say in a context, this is theory or this is not. But it points to a kind of a breakdown in being able to name what a theorist is that comes about precisely through probing at the question, and for which history of theory offers a workaround by always giving it a context and being able to say, in this context, one is a theorist, because all theorists, right, are never just theorists, right? We have many identities. But I think this question, I guess the question there is the role of rationality, systematicity. Are these things that is it the main criterion by which we continue to determine what is or isn't theory? And then what does consideration of identity and identities do to that criterion? Kristen, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was really struck by both of the papers this morning, just in terms of the idea of like what it means, again, maybe a bit selfishly, to do biographical work on a theorist, but also thinking of what August was just saying about like sort of existing within kind of multiple spectrums or circles or something, how both of the figures that you talked about were existing and moving between different kind of geopolitical and in some cases sort of religious or professional meanings of what it meant to be a theorist or a musician or an academic in different sort of places, in different decades, in very different centuries. And yeah, I don't know. I don't have question-like material, but I find that way of approaching the life of the historical theorist really compelling.
I think that the definition and trying to broaden the definition of who is a theorist and what is theory is ultimately going to be a social justice issue, because like our field, I think, definitely did define a theorist or a theory as something that's systematized on a very high intellectual level. And as we gradually started to look at other things, we can now admit public music theory and theory by people who don't write things down, and theory by people who are marginalized in all kinds of senses, you know, such that, just as you were all talking, this article by Kofi Agawu about who gets cited, you might know that, it has to do with often, like, citation is a form of granting privilege. And so often Africans, he was specifically talking about African music, that the actual practitioners don't write articles and so don't get cited. And so their ideas kind of get discounted. And so I do think that it's absolutely critical that we think about what is theory, and think about what we're doing when we define the field. I think it has become the case that it's no longer that you have to have a higher level theoretical apparatus, but it's like, how are we marginalizing people or ideas by our definitions?
I think relevant to this discussion is also beyond the who. And this has come up in multiple different contexts. It's the how and what of the actions. You know, aside from the formulations systematized or no within publications, which I think does replicate in current institutional practices. Which is to say, there are certain, let's call them teaching expectations of the identification of a music theorist that then comes into play on hiring practices, but it also has a bearing on, you know, what a theory curriculum looks like in a conservatory environment versus what a theory curriculum looks like in an R1 research institution environment, which is what it looks like in a liberal arts environment, et cetera. And in some ways, there is no single sort of stability of the idea of theorists, but there's a certain fungibility nonetheless. In terms of being able to move either together to discuss these issues. I think where history of theory comes into play is also historicizing, you know, not just the kind of written, published, manuscript, whatever it might be, record of words on the subject, but also historicizing all the different kinds of practices, which include a kind of pedagogies and other forms of, you know, knowledge replication, et cetera. That have sort of burbled beneath the surface of some of the conversations of the past couple of days, but haven't really come up explicitly. You know, you could say, you know, it's what you say you are versus what you do in the institutional practices in which, or para-institutional practices in which theory is done.
And we have Aaron Gerard's dissertation. I mean, to that point, Aaron Gerard's dissertation at Harvard is directly relevant, right? Because it historicizes the institutionalization of theory at Yale and Princeton, mid-century and later, and shows how, you know, almost the documents fade, but the actions of the actors becomes the primary, you know, whatever, source of creation of identity, and of what a music theorist is.
I think, Drew, thank you for bringing up pedagogy. It makes me think, you know, at my institution, a large part of the students I teach are DMA students, right? And I think about what music theory means to them and what the aim is. It is not to interpolate them into the world of scholarship, right? They're not going to become, you know, music theorists in a formalized, institutionally backed professional sense. But they also tend to come in with ideas about, if not what a music theorist is, what music theory is. And it's often very bound up with notions of correctness, right, and knowledge, and finding the right answer, and of course presumably the power that comes with being right. And I think in that context, for me, a lot of what being a music theorist is paradoxically disabusing them of that notion of saying, well, you think it's about knowledge, but maybe it's not. What if it's about communication, right? What if it's about being able to explain your experiences of music in modalities other than playing your instrument, singing, right? That it's using language to communicate effectively. And then the broader question here is, well, does that now make them music theorists after all? I'm not sure, but thank you for mentioning that context. Oh, yeah.
Feel free to shut this down if it's too off to one side, but I hear it's interesting generational spread here, and Jenny remarks are really interesting, that you see some sort of, kind of, I don't know, positive epoch or something that we're managing to get to because our modes of discourse, what we talk about, how we talk about them are improving in some sense. How does that harmonize, or does it harmonize with kind of on the pedagogical institutional side, what seems like a decrease in the ability to explicitly be historians of music theory in terms of courses offered, in terms of maybe even as you were saying in your own experience, in terms of professional work being recognized as such. And this is maybe kind of a history question. The birth of SMT, or the birth of studying historical theory in an AMS context. I'm interested in anyone speaking to where that came from, where it's going, and I don't know how these seemingly conflicting trajectories are happening at the same time.
I guess in my mind, how I've perceived is that in this particular subfield of the history of theory has the privilege of a historical lens, as Drew also alluded to, that might help us think about the premises of what we do through this kind of distance, or there's like just another methodological thing to draw on. And I guess the discussions we're having here about what identity is, we've had all these very diverse case studies, I guess, presented, but they might help us to reflect a bit further about where we are going and how we identify meaning, what's at stake in our field. And that's in the history of theory, but also the music theory at large, or musicology, whatever, however you want to call it. And I guess one of the underlying questions, obviously, is that we're hinting at all the time is this way in which identity is a way of normalizing or normatizing things, obviously, and excluding people from certain access points and prerequisites, which is obviously a very current topic. So I feel like getting avenues to thinking about these questions through the particular case studies that we bring to the table might just be this very helpful thing that we can bring to the field at large. That would be one of the thoughts I had for that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, maybe, this is way too simplistic, but maybe it's a way to spark discussion. In some ways, the very institutionalization of theory was itself already a history of theory. I think in some ways, history of theory is what the institution, or at least historically, was within the work that Anne-Maria Bussiberger has done. Looking at what's happening in comparative context. In some ways, it was ultimately preoccupied with certain notions of historical progression and finding that in all sorts of complicated and troubling ways. And maybe one way of saying the contemporary moment is a kind of forgetting of its own historicity. You know, I've certainly had conversations with colleagues to say that often what's taught in a music theory classroom is a kind of history of theory that doesn't present itself as historicized, right? And that's, I know, putting way too, that's packaging up a complicated discussion in a kind of glib framework. But I think one thing that the present moment is doing is actually reopening, pluralizing, you know, the histories that are possible while attempting to mark and frame a lot of what's happening within our classrooms as historical and historicized in particular ways. So in some ways, I see the history of theory as not a kind of either a uli sunt, lamentation of what was once and could be again, nor do I see it as a latecomer that's there to disrupt. I think it's actually been in the mix and part of the problem and part of the solution, all along. And I think its changing relationship to the professional society is just part of a story that's as old as the institutionalization of music studies itself. Again, too simple a way of putting a complex story, but that's one way to look at it.
I really like all the ways that we're bringing in pedagogy into that conversation, because I do think history of theory as a field of study has done a lot for my teaching, because my big concern is to not naturalize any of the things that we're doing in those classes at the lower levels. So I actually assign parts of, I was raised to call it the Chowmet. I know that not everyone calls it that. I do assign chapters of it though, or excerpts of them in the freshman theory classes, because I want them to understand that this didn't just fall from the sky. And I try to remind them that during different points in the curriculum. But I think the danger has always been that we're going to naturalize what we're doing. And that's how I learned it too, I think. So, like someone was saying about I also teach a graduate class where they come in with a lot of preconceived notions of what a theorist is and what theory is, and then we don't really do any of that stuff. For my own sort of institutional reasons, I've chosen to just sort of hijack that class and make it a lot more philosophical, because I want to break down those notions of well, the canon is this, and it all works this way, or whatever. I mean, it's ideology that they have had reinforced for them throughout their education leading to that point. And I just feel like my whole purpose is to try to undo it, because it comes with so much ideological baggage that I think can actually be quite harmful. And actually, on that note, I really appreciated Stefano's nuancing of the distinction between an actual wolf and the metaphorical wolves that were in Andrew's paper. But I don't think that they're completely separate. And I think the important takeaway for me there is that, yes, actual wolves can do actual violence and hurt people, but it's always interesting to see what kinds of metaphors people take into their theories, because, why are they attracted to violent metaphors, or why are they attracted to gendered metaphors, or whatever it is. And those things are not neutral. That comes with a lot of ideological baggage as well. So those are things I feel like history of theory can really bring and enrich my own teaching with. It's a much more nuanced view. Like a lot of times my grad students come in and think, we're going to just do harder part writing. And somehow it will just level up, And it's just not that at all. But you don't know what history, or you don't know what theory is really as an undergrad a lot of the time. So anyway.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Abby. I wanted to build on what Drew and you were both saying by noting, I guess, that when I learned about this pre-conference and when we were all first talking about it, I thought that, identity politics was actually going to kind of come and live in the center of the room. And maybe in some ways it sort of has, but actually, the link to the 90s that I've gotten out of this discussion in these papers is more about historical critique, another kind of Foucauldian strain through the 90s that I think somehow this subfield in musicology and music theory has realized is very valuable to be able to offer to the discipline. Yeah. know, as kind of keepers of the historical record, we have an ability to use historical critique to do that kind of important ideological work, to unseat assumptions of all different kinds, having to do with identity sometimes, but mostly having to do with how knowledge and power operate. Again, another 90s theme. And so actually I feel like the return, although I was expecting it to be much more focused on kind of questions of race and ethnicity and sexuality and other kinds of identity questions, has been much more fundamental in its critical apparatus. That's my sense of things, but I don't know if you all agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't happen, it maybe happened by chance. I mean, I don't know that it happened, you know, I think August and the rest of us had race as kind of one of the primary concerns when August suggested identity and when we talked about it as a topic for the pre-conference. And yeah, it's just by chance that the kind of, as you're saying, the kind of meta questions or the kind of more fundamental questions that become centered in the pre-conference. The question I would have then is, well, what does that, and absolutely value of critique and power and how that denaturalizes and, you know, what it can bring to the field and how that can help situate one's identity as a scholar or a thinker is crucial. But also I do wonder what the precipitate then out of that is in terms of those kind of protected statuses, or you know what I mean, of those more typically understood identities. In other words, okay, so where did they go? Are they in the room? You know, what is then the status of those things, and how? What is our response? You know, these are ethical questions. What is our responsibility here?
Well, I think one of the things that I think it came through in a lot of the papers and conversation yesterday and today was, I mean, there's a lot of talk in queer musicology, where I also sometimes live, about like the idea that even like privileged identities often are erased in these conversations, but like identity of any kind is never neutral and is never inevitable and is sort of always contingent on any number of historical and sociocultural formations. And I was really struck, particularly today, but also yesterday, by how many presenters really emphasize that like the identity of the music theorist is never neutral or inevitable and is always sort of historically and socioculturally situated. And I guess I've spent a lot of time thinking about like I read more about sort of history of musicology, so the identity of the musicologist in different times and places. But yeah, I think it can be very easy for us to forget that, you know, scholars are human beings, and that like the intellectual identities that we take on are also related to or in relationship to kind of other things in our lives and in our communities. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I like this idea, Roger, that you raised of you know, keepers of the historical record, or that historical critique is being centered, because I think it would be obtuse for anyone to deny that one strain of music theory for a long time has been its kind of transhistorical ambitions, right? I mean, from Fétis, Schenker, some American music theorists in the 20th century. And so the gesture of always historicizing, it ends up with a kind of weird topography, right? If our identity as theorists and historians of theory, but as theorists, identifying as theorists, is predicated on undermining or critiquing or historicizing the very thing on which the field has often renewed itself, right? Well, no, I mean, the history of theory begins generally as a subdiscipline with people saying, well, everyone else was wrong, but now I've figured it out, right? This is how music really works. Yeah, and the idea that we're, yeah, that one becomes, in some sense, at least in this room, a theorist by undertaking the sort of auto-critique. That it becomes a kind of specific identity within the larger category of theorist, but one that has this paradox at its center. But I love that.
I mean, paradox at its center, both prestige, right, because it has the classic learning, you know, of historical documents and languages and things like that, and it's typically taught at R1 universities. And as you're saying, also the kind of perhaps queer topography whereby we both fundamental and marginalized in a way. You know, speaking as someone who does not have an academic position and is responsible for thinking about music more broadly than simply, not simply, but then solely theoretically. In terms of identity, yeah, it's definitely become a situation where history of theory, you know, always was enabled the entree into musicology more generally, right? The kind of auto-critique is something that can be performed, right, as a historian of theory, given the context in which one finds oneself.
I'm very inspired and can very much relate to the discussion so far, and I think it is interesting for the epistemology of music theory to see how that question of identity is actually shifting into a question of what is theory, or how can we, because it's slightly different, and I think that's very interesting. Now, I just want to, let's say, remind you of a caution here of when we discuss theory. So far, what I see, the scholarly theory background, history theory, as we understand it and such, is very much from its origin as a discipline within the university is very much an American aspect. And music theory in other parts of the world has a completely different understanding and completely different pedagogical practice. And we need to, of course, there are always intersections, and it's never completely different. But just anecdotally, you know, I'm a person of the 1980s. You know, when I studied in the 1980s, and historical considerations of theory were banned from music theory in the conservatory. Where I did that was I had to go musicology, specifically had to go to the university to study musicology in Germany. That's where you got the academic part. And up to date, if I talk with my same age colleagues, in Vienna or wherever, the music theorists there say, no, theory is not an academic field. It's part of the art training, künstlerisches Lehrfach, künstlerisches Fach. Specifically, and they don't even call it theory. It is historische Satzlehre. It's that what you learn and do. And another word that cannot be translated specifically into English. This historische Satz. And they I said, oh, you're a music theorist, and no, I'm not. I do historische Satzlehre. It's an art field. It's not an academic field. So this insistence of we are artists. We're not academics. That's what musicology does. It's a very strong trend that I learned in, as a student, and still see a lot with my European colleagues today, which is an interesting factor, and we must not forget that there is really those very different perspectives. Now, what does that mean for the historical perspective that we are implying onto the field? And how we define it as an historical field. I think that's interesting that those artist-oriented theorists, let me call it like this, are specifically, I wouldn't say deny history, but see it that, they teach it in a presentist sense that you do it here and now with, of course, with historical examples, the various styles, historical styles, but not historical theory. And that is very important to differentiate. And going back to some of the names that were today, you mentioned Fétis and that criticism of where does that come from. He has, of course, this different academic perspective of seeing, okay, I need to justify my harmonic tonality idea by historical models and ideas. That's a very non-theoretical approach, non-conservatory approach. It's really an academic approach. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind when we're discussing those various epistemological questions in music theory.
Their books might not identify as theorists, but we certainly can call it that. Thinking of Lester's book, Compositional Theory, that's pedagogical instruction that we identify as music theory from our perspective. So the historical record, can cast different identities on people than they would claim for themselves.
Right. Which is, funny enough, something that hasn't come up at the conference. People who have been labeled theorists who are not. It reminds me of, there's a comment in Gottfried Weber, in one of the prefaces to his Versuch, where he kind of says, well, I guess now that I'm known as a theorist. It's the first instance I know of historically someone saying that, but it's a wonderful thing. And I mean, you can see its continuation in a way, in what you're saying, Frank. But I am noticing that the clock up here says 12:04. So if anyone wants to say one more thing, please do. But if not, I think we should draw this to a close.
We should thank everyone and
thank
you all
yes.
for coming and all the departments that helped fund this and everything. Thank you so much.
So thanks so much.